So there seems to be this growing trend of censoring and silencing people and ideas that we don't like. I can think of several instances in which speakers and activists have been refused entry into certain countries, and even some that have been jailed for behavior that some would argue is protected by freedom of speech. And just this week, Alex Jones and his InfoWars media company have been banned from their social media accounts, including YouTube and iTunes and Facebook, all on the same day, which, if you're trying to reduce his influence as a conspiracy theorist, the optics of that do not look very good. Now, I'm not a fan of Alex Jones. I don't think I've ever watched one of his videos or listened to his podcast, so I don't really have a dog in this fight, but I am interested and even concerned in the precedent that is being set by these kind of Orwellian maneuvers. I recently saw a photo of a sign at a political protest that said something like, "Fear plus ignorance equals hatred." And I think that there's some truth to that. And if that is true, then it would stand to reason that the best way to disrupt the proliferation of hatred is by disrupting one of those two variables. But the response we've been seeing seems to be based on the idea that the best solution to ignorance and fear is to revoke the freedom of those whose ideas we don't like, either through restricting their mobility or just locking them up. But I'd argue that ignorance and fear are symptoms of not being free enough. It's what happens when people are held hostage by their own limited perspective. For example, those who are illiterate have to live in a much smaller world than those of us who get to share in and learn from the adventures of a Bilbo Baggins or a Huckleberry Finn, or just being able to read a history book. A person who denies the Holocaust as a really egregious example isn't someone who is abusing their freedom, it's someone who is acting out of captivity to ignorance. And the antidote to ignorance is to free them from that isolation through something like education. And we don't seem to be doing a very good job of that. A kind of humorous anecdote that supports that point is a Jimmy Kimmel segment that I saw recently, in which they went on onto the street and asked people to name a book, any book, and nobody could do it. And then in another segment, they did the same thing. They went out and they put up an unlabeled map of the world and asked people to name any country on that map. And the people that made it onto the air, every single one of them failed to do so. Now, granted, that's not everybody, but the fact that they were able to find enough people over the course of an afternoon to fill a segment like that is kind of scary. So to try to summarize my point so far, I'd say that the antidote to fear and ignorance is a proper education in what is true and good, rather than the suppression of freedom. And this all reminds me of this saying of Jesus that sounds really nice and is pretty agreeable for most of us, but I wonder how many people actually really get anything out of it. He said that truth will set you free. So there's this correlation between freedom and truth, so that when people are less free, it's a symptom of their estrangement from truth. And ignorance, I would conclude from that, is a kind of slavery of the mind. So if we want people to be less ignorant, then we should be trying to do everything we can to liberate them with more truth and therefore freedom. Instead, we seem to be opting for less freedom. But I know a lot of people will immediately retort that Christianity, with all its rules and restrictions, has no place in a conversation like this because it's such an impediment to freedom. But I would reply that it's fairly easy to observe how commandments and rules exist to actually increase and expand our freedoms. Take the rules of the road, for example. You could complain about speed limits and right-of-way and traffic lights as an infringement upon your freedom to do whatever you want. So what if all of those were just taken away? Well, there would instantly be gridlock everywhere, and you'd be saddled with a catastrophic absence of freedom. Measured restrictions that correlate to what is good and true actually maximize freedom. Or take something like learning a musical instrument. If you set aside all the best practices and were just left to your own devices, you might learn a little bit, but you'll also develop a lot of bad habits that will prevent you from growing to what you could have otherwise done if you had observed those disciplines. So I'd say that truth and freedom are what competes with ignorance and fear. But sadly, we seem to be taking the opposite approach to combating the ingredients of hatred, and I just don't see how that's going to work. If conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones are trying to convince the world that their message is good and true and dangerous to those in power, then using power to suppress their message is only going to fan the flames of conspiracy and suspicion. If someone is acting out of ignorance, attacking their freedom by censoring them or by arresting them won't help, because freedom is merely a symptom of truth, whatever truth they happen to still possess. Instead, we should be attacking their ignorance with more truth, which will lead to more freedom. The proliferation of freedom should be our aim, not the restricting of it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.